The symphony center was always quietest when the sun went down. During the day, the place was a chaotic mess of noise. People rushed around in suits, shouting orders, moving equipment, and preparing for the next big show. But by midnight, the chaos was gone. The heavy footsteps of the musicians and the chatter of the audience had faded away, leaving only the sound of air conditioning humming softly from the vents. This was the time David liked best. It was the time when the grand building felt like it belonged only to him. David was a member of the cleaning crew. It wasn't a glamorous job. His uniform was a simple gray jumpsuit with his name stitched on the pocket, and his cart was filled with spray bottles, mops, and trash bags. Most people looked right through him. To the patrons of the arts, he was just part of the furniture, someone who erased the footprints from the carpet so the floor would look brand new for the next day. But David didn't mind being invisible. It gave him the freedom to admire the place without anyone bothering him. He pushed his heavy cart down the long, velvet-carpeted aisle toward the stage. The auditorium was huge, a towering bowl of red seats and gold trim. At the very front, bathed in a single beam of moonlight coming through the high windows, sat the star of the room. It was a concert grand piano. It was a massive beast of an instrument, black and shiny, reflecting the world around it like a dark mirror. David stopped his cart at the edge of the stage and just looked at it. He did this every single night. It was his ritual. He slowly climbed the carpeted steps that led to the platform. The floor felt solid under his work boots, a stark contrast to the slippery floors he mopped in the lobby. As he got closer to the piano, he felt that familiar tug in his chest. It was a mix of pain and love, so strong it almost made him physically ache. 10 years. It had been 10 years since he had last let his fingers dance over ivory keys. David reached out with a gloved hand but stopped just inches above the cold smooth surface of the piano lid. He didn't dare touch it. He wasn't allowed to. The rules for the cleaning staff were very strict: look, but do not touch. The instruments were worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, and his bosses made it clear that a fingerprint was a disaster. But sometimes, in the deepest quiet of the night, he liked to pretend. He pulled his hand back and stood there, closing his eyes. In the darkness of his mind, he wasn't holding a mop handle. He was holding his brother's hand. He could see the old, upright piano they had in their living room growing up. It had been a cheap thing, slightly out of tune, with a sticky key on the F sharp. But to David and his brother, it had been a treasure. They used to sit on that bench for hours. His brother, Michael, had the raw talent. He could play anything by ear. David was the one who learned the theory, the one who practiced scales until his fingers hurt. They were a team. They promised each other that one day, they would both be on a stage like this, playing for a crowd that loved music as much as they did. But life doesn't always keep promises. The memory hit David hard, like it always did. The screech of tires. The blinding headlights, the silence that followed. The accident had taken Michael in an instant. It had also taken something from David. The moment he heard the news, the music inside him just stopped. He tried to play a few weeks after the funeral, sitting at that old upright piano alone, but his hands wouldn't work. They shook too much. Every time he pressed a key, he didn't hear a note, he heard the sound of the hospital monitor flatlining. He felt the cold absence of the person who should have been sitting next to him. So, he quit. He sold the piano. He moved to a new city and took a job where he didn't have to speak, didn't have to create, and didn't have to feel. He cleaned up after other people's performances because he was too scared to make his own. David opened his eyes and looked at the grand piano again. The left sleeve of his gray jumpsuit hung empty and flat. The accident hadn't just taken his brother, it had taken his arm below the elbow. He looked at the smooth black finish of the instrument and shook his head slightly. "Who am I kidding?" he whispered to the empty room. His voice sounded small, swallowed instantly by the vastness of the theater. He grabbed his feather duster from the cart. He had a job to do. He needed to dust the railings and the music stands before the sun came up. He moved around the piano carefully, treating it like a sleeping animal that might wake up if he made a sudden noise. He ran the soft feathers over the brass handles of the benches and the polished wood of the music rack. As he worked, he found himself drifting again. It was hard not to. Even though he couldn't play, his body remembered. He felt a phantom itch in the fingers of his missing hand. He wanted to feel the vibration of the strings, the resistance of the keys. He wanted to feel that connection where the instrument becomes an extension of your soul. Instead of playing, he danced with his movements. He didn't just dust, he flowed. He moved the duster in a rhythm that mimicked a waltz. He stepped side to side, his movements graceful and fluid, defying the clumsiness of his missing limb. For a few minutes, in the dark, he wasn't a janitor. He was a conductor of silence, commanding the dust motes that floated in the moonlight. He was so lost in his own world that he didn't hear the soft click of a side door opening. He didn't hear the footsteps on the thick carpet. He was moving his hands in the air, tracing the shape of a melody that existed only in his head, a melody Michael used to hum. It was only when he turned to grab a glass cleaner that he saw the man standing in the wings. David froze. He nearly dropped the bottle. Standing just off to the side of the stage, leaning casually against a thick velvet curtain, was a figure dressed in a sharp tuxedo. David's heart skipped a beat. It was Julian Vross. David knew who Julian Vross was. Everyone in the city knew. Julian was the reason this hall was sold out every weekend. He was a prodigy, a genius of the piano who could make the instrument sing, cry, and scream. His face was on posters all over the lobby. Seeing him in person, standing there in the dim light, was shocking. David immediately straightened his back, panic setting in. He wasn't supposed to be dancing. He wasn't supposed to be pretending. He was just supposed to be cleaning. I'm sorry, sir, David stammered, clutching the cleaning bottle to his chest like a shield. I didn't know anyone was here. I'll finish up and get out of your way. He expected Julian to wave him away, or to look annoyed. He expected to be treated like the staff, invisible and unimportant. But Julian didn't move. He didn't look annoyed. He was watching David with an intensity that made the older man uncomfortable. There was a softness in the famous pianist's eyes, a look of curiosity that hadn't been there a moment ago. Julian pushed himself off the wall and took a few steps onto the stage. The spotlight from the moon caught the side of his face. He wasn't looking at David's uniform, and he wasn't staring at the empty sleeve. He was looking at David's eyes. "Don't apologize," Julian said. His voice was smooth, quiet, but it carried easily across the stage. "I've been watching you for 10 minutes. David felt his face get hot. He wished he could just melt into the floorboards. I was just cleaning, sir. I didn't mean to disturb you." "You weren't just cleaning," Julian said. He walked closer, stopping a few feet away. He pointed a finger toward the piano. "I saw your hands. The way they moved in the air. You weren't dusting the notes. You were playing them." David stood there, stunned. He didn't know what to say. He felt exposed, as if this stranger had reached into his chest and pulled out a secret he had buried for a decade. He looked down at his feet, ashamed. I used to play. A long time ago. But that's not my life anymore." "Music has a way of staying in the blood," Julian said gently. He walked over to the piano and ran his own hand along the sleek curve. "It doesn't care what job you have. It doesn't care what you look like. It just wants to be heard." David looked up. The fear was still there, mixed with a strange sensation in his stomach, a longing he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. He looked at the piano, then at the man who owned the stage. "Every night you come here," Julian continued, his tone almost conversational, as if they were old friends catching up. "I've seen you from my dressing room window. You look at this instrument like you are looking at a ghost. Why do you stay away from it?" David swallowed hard. He felt a lump forming in his throat. "Because it hurts," he admitted, his voice cracking slightly. "Because I'm not whole anymore. And that piano, it deserves someone who is." Julian shook his head slowly. He looked at the piano, then back at David with a small, knowing smile. "Music isn't about being perfect, David," Julian said. "And it certainly isn't about being whole in the way you think. It is about honesty. It is about having the courage to let the pain out instead of keeping it locked inside." David felt a tear prick the corner of his eye, but he blinked it away. The air in the vast hall seemed to change. The quiet wasn't empty anymore, it was heavy with anticipation. "You have a story to tell," Julian said. He walked to the side of the piano bench and pulled it out slightly, creating an inviting space. "And I think this instrument is tired of sitting in the dark." David stared at the open bench. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He looked at his one good hand, then at the space where his other hand should be. He thought about Michael. He thought about the silence that had filled his life for 10 years. Julian didn't pressure him. He just stood there, waiting. He extended a hand toward the bench, a silent dare in the air between them. "Are you brave enough to try?" Julian asked softly. David took a shaky breath. He left his cleaning cart behind and took a small step forward. David stood frozen at the edge of the stage, his work boots feeling incredibly heavy against the thick carpet. The silence in the huge hall wasn't peaceful anymore, it felt heavy, like it was waiting for him to make a choice. He looked at the open bench, then back at Julian Vross. The famous pianist didn't look like he was joking. He looked calm, patient, like a teacher waiting for a student to solve a math problem. But this wasn't math. This was David's life, and the equation didn't add up. "I can't," David said, his voice barely a whisper. He took a step back, retreating toward the safety of his cleaning cart. "Sir, please. You don't understand. It's been 10 years. And look at me." He gestured to his left side, where the gray sleeve of his jumpsuit hung limp and empty. He felt a hot flush of shame rise up his neck. "It takes 2 hands to make music like this. I'm just a cleaner. I'm nobody. Please, just let me finish mopping the floor so I can go home." He expected Julian to agree. He expected the famous musician to laugh, or maybe just look disappointed and walk away. That's what people usually did when they realized the extent of the damage. They got uncomfortable. They looked away. But Julian didn't look away. He didn't even glance at the empty sleeve. Instead, he walked over to the piano and sat down on the bench himself. He didn't play immediately. He just sat there, his posture relaxed, his hands resting lightly on his knees. "You think music is about fingers?" Julian asked quietly. His voice echoed softly in the empty room. "You think it's about how many keys you can press at the same time?" David stopped backing away. He watched, mesmerized in spite of himself, as Julian placed his right hand on the keys. He began to play. It wasn't a loud, crashing song. It was a simple melody, slow and haunting. The notes floated up into the high ceiling like smoke. David knew the song. It was an old folk tune, something sad and sweet. As Julian played, he didn't use his left hand at all. He kept it resting in his lap. He played the entire melody with just 5 fingers on his right hand, filling the gaps with the pedal, making the notes sing and cry without needing the bass. The sound washed over David. He closed his eyes for a second, and the smell of the cleaning supplies vanished. He was back in his childhood living room. He could hear the rain against the window. Wait, no rain, he thought, shaking the memory away. He could hear the sound of the old heater rattling. He saw Michael sitting there, smiling, playing that exact same tune to cheer him up after a bad day at school. Julian struck the final chord, letting it fade into nothingness. The hall went quiet again, but the air felt different now. Charged. "One hand," Julian said, turning to look at David. "I played that with one hand." The music was still there. The feeling was still there. David stared at him. He felt a lump in his throat the size of a golf ball. "That's you," David croaked. "You're a genius. I'm just broken." Julian stood up slowly. He walked over to where David was standing. Up close, the pianist didn't seem like a celebrity. He looked tired. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his posture held a stiffness that suggested he carried his own heavy burdens. "I am not a genius," Julian said, shaking his head. "I am just a man who is scared of stopping. You know what people tell me? They tell me I play perfectly. They tell me my technique is flawless. But sometimes, I feel like a robot. I hit the keys, and the sound comes out, but I don't feel it like I used to." He paused, looking around the vast, empty theater. I saw you tonight, David. I saw you dancing with the feather duster. I saw the way you looked at this piano. You weren't looking at a piece of furniture. You were looking at a friend you missed terribly. That kind of hunger that isn't broken. That is rare. David looked down at his feet. He didn't know what to say. No one had ever spoken to him like this before. To everyone else, he was the guy who emptied the trash bins. To Julian, he was something else. I miss him, David admitted, the words slipping out before he could stop them. My brother. He was the one with the talent. We were supposed to play together. I'm just the leftover half. Julian stepped closer. Do you think your brother would want you to hide? Do you think he would want you to be scared of a wooden box because he isn't here to hold your hand? The question hit David like a punch to the stomach. He thought of Michael. He thought of Michael's loud laugh, the way he always pushed David to be better, to be braver. Michael would hate seeing him like this, scared of his own past. Music isn't about the past, Julian said, his voice soft but firm. And it isn't about being perfect. It's about the truth. It's about taking whatever pain you have inside and letting it out so it doesn't eat you alive. You have a story, David. This piano can help you tell it. Julian walked back to the piano bench. He moved it slightly to the side, clearing the space. He gestured to the empty seat. I dare you, Julian said. David blinked. You dare me? Yes. I dare you, Julian repeated. A small smile played on his lips. Sit down. Don't play a concerto. Don't try to impress me. Just play one note. Play one chord. Just reconnect with the sound. If you hate it, you can walk away, and I will never mention it again. I promise. David's heart hammered against his ribs so hard he could hear it in his ears. He looked at the cleaning cart 10 feet away. It represented safety. It represented a life where he didn't take risks, where he didn't get hurt. Then he looked at the piano. It represented the unknown. It represented grief, but also love. He felt his legs moving before his brain could tell them to stop. It was like he was being pulled by a magnetic force. He walked slowly, step by step, toward the stage. The carpet felt softer here, like it was cushioning him for a fall. He reached the bench. It was polished black wood, gleaming under the single light. He turned and sat down. The bench was firm, holding him steady. Suddenly, he was eye level with the keys. They were white and black, stretching out like an endless landscape. His right hand trembled as he raised it. His left sleeve fluttered slightly as he moved his arm. Just one note, Julian whispered from somewhere behind him. David took a deep breath. He closed his eyes for a second and pictured Michael's face. Don't be afraid, Davy, he imagined his brother saying. It's just noise until you put your soul into it. He opened his eyes. He didn't think about scales. He didn't think about the complicated pieces he used to practice. He just reached out and pressed down a single key in the middle of the keyboard. C sharp. The note rang out, clear and bright. It bounced off the walls and filled the entire hall. The sound was deeper than David expected. It vibrated through the bench, up his spine, and into his chest. It was a physical sensation, like a heartbeat that wasn't his own. He held his breath. He didn't play another note. He just let that one sound hang in the air, ringing out until it faded into silence. He waited for the pain to come. He waited for the memory of the crash to flood his mind and make him pull away. But it didn't happen. Instead, he felt a strange sense of peace. It felt like a dam cracking, just a tiny bit, letting the water trickle out. "Good," Julian said softly. David didn't turn around, but he could hear the smile in the man's voice. "That was a brave start. Now, don't think. Just listen. What does that note want to say?" David looked at his hand resting on the white key. He felt the phantom presence of his other fingers. Slowly, hesitantly, he moved his thumb to the key next to it. He pressed down. D. Then his index finger. F. He wasn't playing a song. He was just searching. He was walking through a dark room, looking for a light switch. But as he played those three notes, a simple chord, he felt a spark ignite in his gut. It wasn't fear. It was anger. It was sadness. It was joy. It was everything he had stuffed down for 10 years, all fighting to get out. He struck the keys a little harder. The sound grew louder. He didn't care if the security guards heard. He didn't care if he was breaking the rules. He was David, the brother of Michael. He was a musician. And for the first time in a decade, he was alive. The sound of that single chord lingered in the air, vibrating against the high ceilings like a held breath. David sat frozen on the bench, his right hand hovering over the keys. For a second, he felt a rush of excitement, a spark of the old magic he used to feel. But almost immediately, the doubt came rushing back in like a cold tide. It was heavy and suffocating. He snatched his hand back as if the piano had suddenly turned red hot. He stood up so quickly that the bench scraped loudly against the floor, the screeching noise echoing rudely through the quiet hall. "I can't do this," he said, shaking his head frantically. His voice was tight, panicky. "It's a mistake. I'm sorry, Julian. I have to go." He turned and started to march away from the instrument, heading toward the edge of the stage where his cleaning cart waited. It felt like a lifeline. If he could just get back to his cart, put on his gloves, and start spraying glass cleaner, everything would go back to normal. He would be just David, the janitor, safe in the shadows. "Wait," Julian said. He didn't shout, but his voice cut through the air, commanding and gentle at the same time. David didn't stop walking. He kept his eyes on the floor, counting the steps to the exit. 10 feet. 5 feet. "You're running away," Julian said. "Why?" "Because it hurts." David spun around, surprising himself with the outburst. He was breathing hard, his chest heaving. "Don't you get it? It's not just about missing fingers or broken arms. Every time I touch a key, I see him. I see Michael. I see the way he looked at me when we were kids. I hear his voice telling me we were going to be famous. And then I remember that he's gone. He's in the ground, Julian. And I'm here. It's not fair. Why should I get to play when he can't? The silence that followed was thick. David's heart pounded in his ears. He had never said those words out loud before. He had buried the anger deep down, hiding it under layers of polite nods and silent hallways. Julian walked over to him. He didn't look sympathetic in a pitying way. He looked understanding. He stopped a few feet away, giving David his space. Fairness is a concept for people who don't make art, Julian said quietly. Life is rarely fair, David. If we only did things when the world was fair, nobody would ever sing, or paint, or love. We would all just stand still. He gestured toward the piano. You think playing this song is for you or maybe for him, but music isn't about bringing the dead back. It's about honoring the life they lived. You are keeping him alive by hiding. If you play, if you really let the sound out, maybe you finally let him rest. And maybe, just maybe, you let yourself heal. David looked at the piano again. It loomed in the center of the stage, a black beast waiting to be fed. He thought about Michael. He thought about the accident. He thought about the long, lonely years of scrubbing floors and feeling invisible. But then another memory surfaced. It was a memory of Michael, sitting at their old beat-up piano at home. Michael had been struggling with a piece of music, getting frustrated, slamming his hands on the keys. David had walked in, ready to comfort him, but Michael had looked up with a grin. It's hard, Davy, Michael had said. But that's why it's good. If it was easy, it wouldn't matter. David felt a tear slide down his cheek, hot and fast. He wiped it away with the sleeve of his gray jumpsuit. I'm scared, David whispered, his voice cracking. I'm scared my hand won't work. I'm scared the music will sound ugly. Julian stepped closer. He reached out and placed a hand on David's shoulder. The touch was firm, grounding. Ugly is okay, Julian said. Honest is better than perfect. I play notes perfectly every night, David. I hit every key at the right time, with the right pressure. But sometimes it feels like nothing. Sometimes I feel like a machine. You have something real inside you. You have a story that needs to be screamed. He squeezed David's shoulder and let go. I'm not asking you to play a whole concert. I'm not asking you to be a virtuoso. I'm daring you to stop being a ghost in your own life. Go back there. Sit down. And play the thing that is hurting you the most. David looked from Julian to the piano, and then back to the exit. The exit meant safety. It meant going back to his small apartment, eating a microwave dinner, and waking up to do it all over again. It meant a life without risk, but a life without color. He looked at the piano. It meant pain, yes. But it also meant life. It meant remembering the good times, not just the bad end. Slowly, David turned around. He walked back to the bench. His legs felt heavy, like lead weights, but he forced them to move. He sat down again. The leather felt cool against his legs. He stared at the keys. They were just pieces of ivory and plastic, but they looked like a mountain he had to climb. He raised his right hand. He looked at his left arm, the empty sleeve resting on his leg. In his mind, he saw Michael sitting next to him on the bench, their elbows bumping together like they used to. "Okay, Mike," David thought. "Okay. We'll do this. Just for a minute." He didn't start with a song he knew. He didn't try to play Beethoven or Mozart. He just placed his thumb on a low, deep note. A low G. He pressed down. Boom. The sound was deep and resonant, shaking the floorboards slightly. It felt like a heartbeat. Then, he let his fingers find the next note. A simple melody began to emerge. It was clumsy. His fingers were stiff and rusty. He missed a note, hitting a sharp instead of a natural, and the sound clanged discordantly. He flinched, expecting Julian to stop him, to tell him he was terrible. Julian didn't say a word. He just stood there in the shadows, listening. David kept going. He ignored the mistakes. He let the melody wander. It was sad, slow, and heavy. He wasn't thinking about the notes anymore, he was thinking about the funeral. He was thinking about the black umbrellas and the gray sky. He poured that image into the keys. The music began to change. It wasn't just sad anymore. It became angry. He struck the keys harder, the notes chopping through the air. He was angry at the driver who hit them. He was angry at the world for turning without Michael. His breathing became ragged. He was playing with just his right hand, but he was using his whole body now, swaying back and forth, putting his weight into the sound. The pain in his chest was pouring out of his fingertips, turning into noise. And then, the anger faded, leaving something else behind. A strange, peaceful feeling. The melody softened. He started playing a tune from their childhood. A lullaby their mother used to hum. The notes were gentle, rolling over each other like waves on a beach. For the first time in 10 years, David wasn't thinking about the loss. He was thinking about the love. He was remembering Michael's laugh, the way he used to steal David's fries, the way they stayed up late writing silly songs together. The music became a tribute. It was a letter written in sound to a brother who couldn't read it, but maybe could hear it. He played the final chord. It wasn't a grand ending. It was soft, a whisper of a chord that faded into silence. David sat there, his hand hovering over the keys. He was breathing hard, sweat trickling down his temple. He felt drained, empty, but also incredibly light. Like he had been carrying a boulder on his back for a decade, and he had finally just set it down. He slowly pulled his hand back into his lap. He stared at the empty keys, afraid to look at Julian. He felt vulnerable, exposed. He had just poured his heart out in front of a stranger. What if Julian hated it? What if he thought it was garbage? He waited for the criticism. He waited for the polite, "Well, that was nice, but you should stick to cleaning." Instead, he heard footsteps. Julian walked over to the piano. He stopped right in front of the music stand. David slowly looked up. Julian's face was wet with tears. The famous pianist, the man who played for kings and queens, was crying. He didn't try to hide it. "Do you know what you just did?" Julian asked, his voice thick with emotion. David shook his head. I just I made a mess of it. I missed a lot of notes. Forget the notes, Julian said fiercely. You made people feel. You made me feel. And that is the only thing that matters. Do you think you can do it again tomorrow in front of a few more people? David's eyes went wide. What? No, I can't. I can't go in front of a crowd. You just did, Julian said, gesturing to the empty hall. You played for the hardest critic of all yourself. And you survived. You have something to give to the world, David. Don't hide it anymore. Please. David looked at his hand, then at the keys. The fear was still there, but it was smaller now. It didn't paralyze him. He looked at Julian and saw the desperation in the man's eyes. Julian needed this as much as David did. Okay, David whispered. Maybe. Just, maybe. Julian smiled, a genuine, warm smile that reached his eyes. Good. Because I have a plan. And you are going to be the star. The sun was setting over the city, casting long, golden shadows across the streets, but inside the symphony center, the atmosphere was buzzing with electricity. It was the night of the big charity gala. The usually quiet hall was packed with people. Everywhere David looked, there were men in expensive tuxedos and women in sparkling gowns. They held glasses of champagne and laughed loud, polished laughs that echoed off the walls. The air smelled like expensive perfume and fresh flowers. David stood in the wings, the curtain brushing against his shoulder. His heart was hammering so hard against his ribs that he thought it might burst right out of his chest. He was still wearing his gray cleaning jumpsuit. It felt wrong. He felt like an intruder at a party he wasn't invited to. He watched the crowd from the darkness, feeling small and invisible. He looked down at his feet. His work boots were scuffed and dusty. He thought about running. He could just slip out the side exit right now. He could go home, put on his TV, and forget that Julian Voss had ever talked to him. It would be so much easier. It would be safe. You aren't thinking about leaving, are you? David jumped. He turned to see Julian standing behind him. Julian was wearing his performance tuxedo, looking sharp and confident. But David saw the slight tremor in Julian's hands as he adjusted his cufflinks. Even the great Julian Voss was nervous. I don't belong out there, David whispered. His mouth felt dry, like it was full of cotton. Look at them, Julian. They are important people. I clean their toilets. They don't want to hear me play. They laugh. Julian shook his head slowly. He stepped closer, lowering his voice so only David could hear. They aren't laughing tonight. They are here because they want to feel something. And you have more feeling in your little finger than most of them have in their entire bodies. Trust me. I'm scared, David admitted. His voice shook. What if my hand freezes? What if I mess up? Then you mess up, Julian said firmly. And you keep going. That is what art is. It isn't a clean floor, David. You can't sweep away the mistakes. You have to play through them. Suddenly, the lights in the hall dimmed. The chatter of the crowd died down. A spotlight hit the center stage. The master of ceremonies walked out to the microphone and began to speak in a booming voice, welcoming everyone to the gala. David felt like he couldn't breathe. This was actually happening. He wanted to turn and run, but he felt rooted to the spot. He looked out at the massive black shape of the grand piano sitting in the middle of the stage. It looked different now. It didn't look like a monster. It looked like a friend waiting for him. Julian stepped out onto the stage. The crowd erupted in applause. David watched from the shadows as Julian walked to the piano and sat down. For the next 10 minutes, David forgot about his own fear. He was mesmerized. Julian played with such power, such speed, that David could hardly believe his eyes. The music was fast and furious, a storm of notes. But then, it changed. The music became soft, melancholy, and beautiful. When Julian finished the final note of his prepared solo, he stood up and bowed. The crowd clapped and cheered, shouting encore. But Julian held up his hand. He signaled for silence. The crowd quieted down, confused. Julian walked to the microphone. He didn't speak immediately. He looked out at the sea of faces, then he turned his eyes toward the wings where David was hiding. "Ladies and gentlemen," Julian said, his voice clear and strong through the speakers. "Tonight, I played music that is technically perfect. I played notes that were written by masters hundreds of years ago. But tonight, I also learned something." He paused. The hall was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. "I learned that true music doesn't come from a page," Julian continued. "It comes from the soul. It comes from survival. It comes from love and loss. We have a special guest tonight. A man who works in this building. A man who takes care of this hall so the rest of us can enjoy it." David felt his knees go weak. He grabbed the heavy velvet curtain to keep from falling over. "Please, welcome," Julian said, gesturing toward the wings, "David." There was a murmur of confusion from the crowd. They looked around, expecting another famous musician in a tuxedo to walk out. David took a deep breath. He let go of the curtain. He forced his legs to move. One step. Then another. He walked out of the shadows and into the bright, blinding spotlight. The cool air of the stage hit his face. He could see the front row now. He saw a man in a suit looking at his watch, bored. He saw a woman adjusting her diamonds. They didn't know who he was. They just saw a guy in a gray jumpsuit. He walked to the piano. Julian smiled at him and patted him on the back before stepping aside. David sat down on the bench. The lights were so bright he couldn't see the audience anymore. It was just a wall of blackness. That was a good thing. He could pretend they weren't there. He placed his right hand on the keys. His left sleeve rested on his leg. He closed his eyes. He blocked out the sounds of the city, the smells of the perfume, and the heat of the lights. He imagined he was back in the living room of his childhood. He imagined Michael was sitting right next to him on the bench. "Don't play for them, Davy," he heard his brother's voice say in his mind. "Play for us." David started to play. He didn't play a classical song. He didn't play jazz. He played the melody from his heart. It was the song he had played the night before, but it was stronger now. He had practiced it in his mind all day. His fingers moved over the keys. At first, they were a little stiff. The opening notes were tentative. But as the melody grew, his confidence grew. He poured everything into the sound. He played the grief of losing his brother. He played the loneliness of the last 10 years. He played the anger he felt at the world. He wasn't just pressing keys. He was telling a story. He was saying, I am here. I am hurt. But I am still here. The music wasn't flashy. It was simple. It was raw. Because he only had one hand to play the melody, the sound had a lot of space in it. It wasn't crowded with too many notes. The silence between the notes was just as important as the notes themselves. It gave the music room to breathe. He played a section that was fast and happy, remembering the times he and Michael laughed until their stomachs hurt. Then, he slowed it down, playing a sad, haunting chord that hung in the air like a sigh. He made a mistake. His finger slipped and hit a wrong key. It jarred. It sounded ugly. David flinched. He almost stopped. But then he heard Julian's voice in his head. Play through it. He didn't fix the mistake. He kept going. He let the wrong note be part of the song. It made the song real. It showed that he was human, that he wasn't a recording. The audience wasn't judging him. He could feel it. The atmosphere in the room had shifted. The bored man in the front row wasn't looking at his watch anymore. The whole room was leaning forward. They were holding their breath. David reached the climax of the song. He played the notes harder, letting the piano ring out loud and clear. He was crying now, tears streaming down his face, but he didn't wipe them away. He let the tears fall. He was giving his brother a tribute, right there on the grandest stage in the city. He was playing for the little kid who wanted to be a musician. He was playing for the man who lost his way. And most importantly, he was playing for himself. He slowed down. He brought the melody to a gentle close. He played one final, soft chord. He let his finger linger on the key, letting the vibration fade away into the silence of the hall. He lifted his hand off the keys. The silence that followed was heavy. It was thick with emotion. David sat there, breathing hard, his heart pounding. He was terrified to open his eyes. He didn't want to see the disappointment. He didn't want to see the polite applause. But then, he heard it. It started as one person clapping. Slow. Rhythmic. Then another person joined in. Then a third. Suddenly, the silence broke. The sound of applause rushed toward him like a wave. It wasn't just polite clapping. It was loud. It was roaring. People were standing up. He could see their outlines rising from the darkness. David opened his eyes. He looked out into the crowd. They weren't bored anymore. They were clapping for him. Some people were wiping tears from their eyes. They understood. They didn't see a janitor in a jumpsuit. They saw a man who bared his soul. David looked to the side of the stage. Julian was standing there, clapping the loudest of anyone. He was beaming, a huge smile on his face. He gave David a thumbs up. David felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the lights. He stood up. He felt shaky, but he felt strong. He bowed awkwardly. He wasn't used to this. He didn't know how to act like a star. So he just bowed from the waist, deeply and sincerely. He wasn't just David the cleaner anymore. And he wasn't just Michael's brother. He was David, the pianist. And for the first time in a long time, he was proud of who he was. The applause inside the symphony center was like a thunderstorm that refused to break. It rolled through the vast hall, crashing against the high ceilings and shaking the very floorboards beneath David's feet. For a man who had spent 10 years trying to be invisible, the sound was overwhelming. It wasn't just noise, it was a physical force that pressed against his chest. David stood center stage, bathed in the blinding white spotlight. He felt dazed, like he was waking up from a long dream. His right hand, the one that had just poured his soul out onto the keys, tingled with a strange vibration. The audience was on its feet. Hundreds of people were clapping, some wiping tears from their eyes, others just staring at him with open mouths. David didn't know what to do. He felt a sudden, intense urge to run. He wasn't a performer. He didn't know how to accept praise. He looked toward the wings, his eyes searching for an exit, for a shadow to hide in. Instead, he saw Julian. Julian was walking onto the stage from the side. The famous pianist wasn't walking to his own piano, he was walking straight toward David. The crowd cheered even louder at the sight of their hero, thinking Julian was coming to take a final bow, but Julian walked right past the microphone and stopped right beside David. He didn't say anything to the audience. He simply turned to David, placed a hand gently on his shoulder, and smiled. It was a smile that said, "We did it." Then, Julian turned David around so they were both facing the crowd, and raised David's right hand high into the air. The applause seemed to double in volume. David felt his face flush hot. He felt like a fraud. He was just a guy in a gray jumpsuit. But looking out into the darkness, seeing the silhouettes of people standing and cheering, he felt something else, too. He felt accepted. They walked off the stage together, stepping out of the harsh light and into the cool, shadowy safety of the wings. As soon as they were backstage, the roar of the crowd faded into a dull hum. David leaned against the heavy brick wall, his legs finally giving out. He slid down until he was sitting on the floor, putting his head between his knees. "Hey, take it easy," Julian said, crouching down beside him. He sounded concerned. "You're hyperventilating. Just breathe." David gasped for air, his chest heaving. I can't believe that just happened. I messed up that one note. The C sharp. It sounded terrible." Julian laughed, a genuine, warm sound. "Nobody cared about the note, David. They cared about the story. You made them feel something real. Do you know how rare that is? I play for thousands of people, and sometimes I look out and see half of them checking their phones. Tonight nobody was checking their phones. You owned them." David sat up, wiping sweat from his forehead with his sleeve. He looked at his hands. "I haven't felt like that in 10 years. It felt like he was there. Like Michael was sitting next to me. Maybe he was, Julian said softly. But you were the one who played. You were the one who had the courage to sit down. Don't forget that. They sat there on the floor for a few minutes while the stage crew hurried around them, dismantling the microphones and moving the equipment. Usually, the crew ignored the janitors, but tonight they were stealing glances at David. Some of them nodded. One guy, a young man who usually just swept the lobby, gave David a thumbs up. David nodded back. For the first time, he felt like he was part of a team. Later that night, after the crowd had gone and the lobby was quiet, David walked back out onto the empty stage. The grand piano was still there, covered now with a thick black velvet cloth to protect it from dust. The lights were off, and the moonlight streamed through the high windows again, just like it had on every other night of his life. But everything was different now. David walked up to the covered piano. He didn't feel the heavy weight of sadness that usually hung over this place. He didn't feel the ghost of his brother as a painful, sharp presence. Instead, he felt a sense of peace. It was a quiet, gentle feeling. He reached out and touched the soft velvet cover. He realized that by playing the music, by letting the pain out, he had finally set it free. He had spent 10 years building a wall around his grief, trying to lock it away so it wouldn't hurt him. But tonight, he had torn the wall down. He had let the grief out, and it hadn't destroyed him. It had made him stronger. He thought about his job. He thought about the cleaning cart and the mops. He knew he would be back tomorrow night. He would still clean the floors. He would still empty the trash. He needed the paycheck. But he also knew he wouldn't be hiding anymore. A few days later, David was in the staff break room, heating up his lunch in the microwave. The room was buzzing with gossip. A few of the other staff members were crowded around a phone, watching a video. "You have to see this, David," one of them said, waving him over. "Someone recorded the gala the other night. It's going viral." David felt a nervous spike in his stomach. He walked over and peered at the small screen. The video was shaky, filmed from the back of the hall, but the audio was clear. He watched himself walk out onto the stage in his gray jumpsuit. He watched himself sit down. He saw himself play. As he watched, he didn't feel shame. He didn't see a broken man. He saw a man who was brave. He saw the way his hand moved across the keys, full of emotion. He heard the silence of the crowd, and then the explosion of applause. The caption under the video read, "The janitor who moved the world." "Is that really you?" a young woman asked, her eyes wide. "I heard Julian Voss refused to play an encore until you came out." David smiled, a small, humble smile. "Yeah. That was me." "You were amazing," she said. "I mean, really amazing." "Thanks," David said. He took his lunch out of the microwave and sat down at the table. He looked around the break room at his co-workers. They were looking at him with a new kind of respect. He wasn't just the invisible cleaning guy anymore. He was David. Life didn't magically become perfect after that night. David didn't suddenly become rich and famous. He didn't quit his job and go on a world tour. He still had bills to pay. He still had days where his back hurt from mopping, and days where he missed his brother so much it hurt to breathe. But things changed in small, important ways. Julian kept his word. He came to the hall a few times a week, not to perform, but to practice with David. He taught David new techniques, ways to adapt the music for his one hand. They played duets together. David would play the melody, and Julian would play the bass, filling in the spaces. They laughed a lot. They made mistakes. They made music. Sometimes, late at night, after the cleaning crew had gone home, David would sit at the grand piano on the stage. He wouldn't play for a crowd. He would just play for himself. He played songs that made him happy. He played songs that made him sad. He played fast, angry songs when he was frustrated, and slow, soft songs when he was tired. He realized that music wasn't a destination. It wasn't a trophy you put on a shelf. It was a companion. It was a way to talk to the world when you didn't have the words. One evening, as the sun was setting and casting long orange beams of light across the stage, David finished playing a simple tune. He sat quietly for a moment, listening to the silence return to the hall. He looked at the empty seat next to him. "I did it, Mike," he whispered into the quiet air. "I didn't run." He stood up, closed the piano lid, and grabbed his cleaning cart. As he pushed it down the aisle toward the exit, he didn't feel like he was leaving. He felt like he was just getting started. The grand hall was silent, but it was a peaceful silence now. It was filled with the memory of the music he had played, and the promise of the music he had yet to create. David walked out the heavy side doors, his head held high, ready for whatever came next. He was no longer just a survivor of a tragedy. He was a musician, a storyteller, and finally, after 10 long years, he was whole.